let me get into introducing my family first. I am Tim, my wife Angie, and our three kids, Claire, Adeline, and Wesley, are serving in the Arab world. And so we, right out of university, actually my wife and I began on staff at a church. Oh yeah, there they are. So Wesley just had his 8th birthday. Did I tell you how old they are? 13, Claire, Adeline is 12, and Wesley turned 8 yesterday. So it's changing in the home. But I came to school. I studied church music, actually. And right out of college, spent 7 years in full-time ministry at a local church in the Twin Cities. That's actually where I met Don, and we got to know Don and Jamie and the family. And after 7 years in ministry, we were on a short-term trip, just like the trip you have an opportunity to go on to like Thailand and El Salvador, was it? Yeah. I was on a trip when, I'm not sure if this is going to be a plug or if it's going to help or hurt, but on a short-term trip, and God flipped our world upside down and called us to go to the other side of the world. So be careful or get ready for the adventure as you go on those short-term trips. But we now serve as missionaries in the Arab world with a thing called Live Dead. Okay, a little participation here, show of hands. Anyone heard of Live Dead before? We got a very few. Okay, so Live Dead is two things. And I saw it on a couple faces out there. It's a name that scares parents. And it's a simple strategy of missions. Live Dead exists for a very laser-focused purpose. We do church planting among unreached people groups, and we do it in teams. That is the fundamental purpose and laser focus of Live Dead, for gospel proclamation in places in the world that have no chance to hear the gospel. And so let me unpack that a little bit. So team, that is a group of people living together in the same place, working together for a common goal. That's how you define a team. Church planting. Not talking about renting a local high school or, in Highmark's case, a hotel, right? Anyone around for the hotel days? I heard Pastor Don mentioning that last week. But, I'm not going to these countries in the Arab world and renting out a local facility, sending out a mailer and inviting people in. We're talking about meeting one person here, a couple people drawing together, a community of faith drawing that is relentlessly focused on Jesus and living their life out for Him. And that's what we mean by church planting. And then the final one, which is critical, is among unreached people groups. We call them UPGs. But let me break that down for you very quickly. Our world is made up of people groups. There's like 240-something countries in the world, but there's well over 14,000 people groups. And so a people group is a people who live in the same area, roughly, speak the same language, and share the same culture. So obviously there's way more people groups than there are countries, because we know subcultures and different things all around the world. And the sad truth that compelled me and my family to move overseas, and what drives Live Dead, is the reality that 42% of this world's population is what we classify as unreached. That's over 7,200 people groups who people live their life, they go about their day, working, kids going to school, afternoon coffee breaks, farmers farming, family vacations, all happening in a context where none of those people will ever have the opportunity to even meet a Christian, let alone have that Christian share the gospel with them. The country I live in, a country of 5 million people, we know of about maybe 20 known believers. That's 0.00000001% Christian. They need to know. That's what compelled me and my family. That's what drives Live Dead forward. That is the thing that said to me, I can't be okay with that. And God said my role in that is to say yes and go overseas. I'm on page 8 of the notes right here. So let me slow down for a second. If we're going to reach this world and tackle this need of unreached people groups, Live Dead is focused on 3 core values. It will only happen if we will abide deeply in Jesus, spend extravagant daily time with Him, be so close to Him that whenever someone meets me, they don't meet me, they meet the Jesus in me. Same is true of you. But if we're going to live the call of God in our lives, we have to abide deeply in Jesus. We focus on apostle. And I don't mean title apostle like I am the Apostle Paul. I mean to apostle as a verb, meaning to take the gospel to the places in the world where the gospel does not exist, where that message is not proclaimed and known. And if we're going to do that, we'll have to live a life of abandon. And I don't mean abandoning responsibility. What I mean is laying down all things that we would ever put between us and saying yes to Jesus. That's what it means to live a life of abandon. The name Live Dead, just so you know, it's not just some strange thing, or some of you think it's strange, some of you think it's trend, cool, I don't know what you might think, but it's from the Bible. So John 12:24, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it abides alone, but if it dies, it brings forth much fruit. So we die dead to our desires, dead to our own motives and ambition, and alive in the adventure of God's call on our life. And that is the context that God called me and my family into, to live overseas in the Arab world. That is the context of what we're going to talk about with our next topic here in our Radical series, continuing on in the topic of radical obedience. You know, this concept of abandon, this idea of I'm going to live my life where there's nothing between me and saying yes to Jesus. This is what radical obedience looks like. So let's remind ourselves of radical. What is the definition of radical, if we remember? It's affecting the fundamental nature of something, okay? In other words, it's taking what we know of a thing and changing it at its most base level, or approaching it in a way that is different at its most base level. So it occurred to me, if we're going to talk about radical obedience, maybe we should get at least some concept of what obedience is at its base level, right? So we'll start there. The definition of obedience is compliance with an order, request, or law, or submission to another's authority. Now, I don't know about you, just think about it for just a second. I didn't think about it long when my first reaction was that does not sound like the world that I live in. You know, this is completely personal. This wasn't fact-checked. This wasn't dug through, but just based on my 43 years of experience in life, having 3 kids, for sure, reveals some of this. But the thought came to me that the idea of obedience is at the very least pretty unpopular in our world. And at the very least, it's just not natural, or something that we enter into naturally. This thought of being obedient, just submitting to someone else and just doing what someone else tells us to do. You know, and anyone who's got kids in this room would know there's a 3-letter word that they all love. What is it? Why? Hey, clean up your toys. Why? Eat your vegetables. Why? You know, let's go for a walk. Why? Play with your toys. Why? Oh, no, wait, I want to do that one. You know, it's just in them. They're like, why? No, you give me a reason. I don't just submit. I just don't do what you want me to do. You give me a good reason, and now we can talk about why I will do what you want me to do. And I thought it was funny. This is a pretty low-quality picture, and I apologize. But as I was looking up the definition, up on the webpage popped this graph, and it said, use over time for obedience. It's been a tough run for obedience lately, it seems. It is trending down. Although 2019 we had a little jump in it, but anyway, here's the reality. We don't often submit to things. We don't often act in obedience without the understanding of the why behind it. I think we still probably, most of us, if we got down to the root of it, would say, yeah, I probably fall in that category. You know, whether it's at work, with family, we see the benefit we get from it, so we will be obedient. But submission to authority is the other side of that said, so we have that one challenge that we'll keep stirring in our mind. The second half of that definition, or the last part, submission to someone's authority. And it occurred to me, you know, we can have a lot of authorities that we submit to in our life. As we make decisions, as we decide what we will or won't do in life, there's a lot of things that can impact us. It could be our families. It could be kids' schedules, sporting events, activities at school, extracurriculars, whatever it is. It could be our own name, our own reputation, our status in our business or our company or among the community. Maybe it's our spouse, okay? Audience participation, get ready. I know, it's a little uncomfortable. I want you to finish this statement. I'm going to say 2 words, and then you're going to say 2 words. Happy wife. Right? Like, is this our main criteria? Is this what I'm going to, what I will be submitted to? Not a bad thing, just to be clear. Angie, she can hear me somewhere. Okay? Or is it the kingdom of God? Is the kingdom of God what we want to live in submission to be the authority of my life that guides what I will be obedient to? I think for most of us in this room, I'm going to assume today that we would hope that it's the kingdom of God. I think that's why you're in a church. And if you're here for the first time or you haven't been here many times, I'll tell you that I believe that God is drawing you and speaking to you, and there's something in your heart that longs for the kingdom of God. And we want this in our lives. There's something there. So with that in mind, let's look to the Bible. Let's look to Scripture to see some examples. There's incredible examples all throughout the whole Bible that will illuminate to us what it looks like to be obedient, and in many ways very radical. And one of the most remarkable acts of obedience I think that we see throughout the entire Bible, it's very applicable to where I live today, and I'll share that with you a little more later, but it's actually from a man who's commonly referred to as the father of faith. And I'm really proud of Pastor Don. He did me a favor last week. He did an entire message on radical faith, and he didn't talk about Abraham, which I'm like, thanks, man. He saved him for me, which is great. And it occurred to me, it would seem to me that the radicality, the radness, if you will, of our obedience is probably directly related to the radness. What's the adjective? With the radness of our faith. Okay. The more rad our faith is, the more rad our obedience can be. The more fully faithful we are to Jesus and where our hope is put, the more we're able to step out into these areas. So let's set it up a bit. I want to look at the life of Abraham, and we're going to get to a story that maybe many of you know, some of you may not, but we're going to take a fresh look at this today. So Abraham is a man who God called to leave his home and go to the place I will show you. So first of all, he's called leave, and you don't know where you're going yet. And in his culture, I live in a culture like this. In the country I live in, a lot of my friends, we live in the capital city. A lot of my friends come in, they work, they have their jobs. The weekend comes along, and they leave the city and they go back to their villages or the land of their fathers. They go back to their village where their family, their people are, and they spend the weekend there, and then they'll come back in and work. So the concept of family is still very tight in that culture, and it would have been even stronger back in Abraham's day. So the thought of being called to leave your family's land, to leave your home, to leave your culture would have been something that was at least different. And it's definitely an act of obedience. I'm not sure if we're quite to radical yet, but we'll keep going. Fast forward, keep moving through Abraham's life. In Genesis 17 and 18, we'll find the story around the birth of Isaac, okay? If you don't know, I'm not going to read it all, but God speaks to Abraham. He comes to visit him a couple different times. He's 99 years old at this point, 99 to 100. His wife, Sarah, is 90 years old, and Abraham is given a promise. God tells him, you will be the father of many nations. Your descendants will outnumber the stars in the sky and the numbers of sand, grains of sand on the beach or in the desert. I don't know why I said beach. Maybe my mind's ready for ready for beach, warmer weather to come. But he's given this promise, but there's some problems. Sarah, his wife, is barren. So God, I have this wife you've given to me, and this is one of the big, probably screw-ups, if you will, of the life of Abraham. But he tries to take the promise of God into his own hands. And again, this is not the point of what we're going to dig into. We won't get into that, but we hear the story of Hagar and her son Ishmael, his servant, and you can read and examine that in the middle of Genesis there. But this is, I'll just give you this one for free. This isn't the point of the sermon today. This is your freebie. Taking God's, how did I say this? When we take God's promises into our own hands and the fulfillment into our own strength, it's a bad idea to think that God needs our help. That's your freebie for today. That's not part of the message, that's whatever, but when we start to take it into our own hands and say, okay, God, thanks for that thing, now I'm going to go do it, we start to get ourselves in trouble. So, now we fast forward, so they've tried to do things their own way, it didn't really work. We're now super old, and these three guys come to Abraham and Sarah, and they tell them, hey, this time next year, we're going to come back, and you're going to have a son. And, the Bible talks about how Sarah laughed, and so the name Isaac means he brings me laughter, or son of laughter, essentially is what the name means. But God comes through on this process, and the seemingly impossible, the thing that seemed to Abraham and Sarah like it was not possible, Sarah says, how am I to enjoy this pleasure at this age? Like, my husband's 100, I'm 90, and you're expecting us to start now, And we got a new mom, new dad in the house. How about we fast forward 80 years and run it back, I don't know, it doesn't feel quite right. Seems a little off. But so we go through all that. Isaac is born. He starts growing. There's a lot of family dynamics that happen with Hagar and Ishmael. Again, I'm giving you things that I'll encourage you. Go read Genesis. Go read this story and you'll hear more about it. But we're going to get to our main text for today, which is in Genesis 22. And that brings us to this focal point, this story. Now, Isaac has grown. Isaac is older now. He's preteen, 12, 13 years old. And then we get to this, the key for today. And so we're going to read through this. And I'm going to interject a few times as we read through this passage. Well, let's start here in Genesis 22. After these things, all the stuff I was just telling you about, all that stuff has happened, the take the promise, then submit, then the angels come, or the men come. We don't know if they're angels, but they come. By the way, I think it's funny. I don't know if you've ever noticed this. I brushed over this story. When the Bible talks about these 3 visitors coming to Abraham, and he freaks out, he runs to Sarah, hey, go grab 3, and he says some Hebrew word, and we skip over it, 3 shekels of flour. That's the wrong word, so don't quote me on that. But he says 3 shekels. I heard a guy talking. He said bring 80 pounds of flour and make bread. Do you know how many loaves of bread you can make with 80 pounds of flour? This was it. So Abraham, that was pretty radical, I thought. So maybe that's when radicalness started in Abraham's life. I don't know. We'll see. But anyway, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Now I want to stop for a moment real quick on this word, here I am. Are there any Hebrew scholars in the room? Awesome. So I can say it wrong and you won't correct me. Hanini is the Hebrew word, which means behold and then I. It's these 2 words put together. So we have the I, the knee, and the hen, which is behold. And it's this idea of not just it's not a class roll call. Tim, present, here I am. It's not that. It's here I am. Behold, I am here. It's much more than a physical presence that is meant with this word, but it's a complete willingness to serve. It's a complete exposure of himself to God, saying, God, who I am is fully open before you. Here I am. I'm ready to do whatever you want. So when Abraham says this, when he hears the voice of God calling him, says Abraham, he's like, here I am, Lord. It's not just I'm over here, I'm behind this bush, So we get this idea, and I want you to pay attention. Remember that, because it's going to come up again later. Let's keep going. God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place which God had told him. On the 3rd day, now I pause there for a second. I heard an Old Testament scholar talking about this, and he pulled out all the maps and did all this stuff. What I'll tell you is, this journey from where Abraham was to the Mount to Moriah, where God told him to go, was at most a half day to a 1-day journey away from where he was. So it'd be if you got a circle, he's here, and he has to go here. Well, it would seem Abraham did this. He took the 3-day journey, to take that half-a-day trip. But he took the real long way around. And I think he's just giving God every opportunity. He's like, okay, God, I'll be obedient. I'm going to give you every chance to slow this down, You sure? You still sure, God? God, are you sure? You sure? Extending the time he had with his son. Extending these last moments he had with him. So anyway, then it continues. Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there, worship, and come back to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went, both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father, and he said, Hanini, my son. Here am I. Now listen. This idea of sacrifice would not have been weird in their culture. They do this all the time, right? So Isaac is familiar with the process. He knows what is coming. He knows what the wood's for. He knows what the fire for. And he knows that there's going to be a sacrifice. And I can imagine that 3-day journey, an Abraham walking and talking about all kinds of things, but probably avoiding a pretty key topic in this whole conversation. That 3-day journey of going. And when his son says to him, Father, he says, here am I. Abraham knows what he's walking to. He says, son, I'm here for you. And I think of my kids, and if I know a hard thing is coming for them, man, I'm here for you, Claire. I'm here for you, Adeline. How can I help you? We don't always get that when we read this. But Abraham says to his son, here I am. What do you need? Sorry. I can just imagine what it's like there. And Isaac brings up the thing that Abraham has been avoiding for 3 days. He says, behold the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? I'm thinking about it and I'm a mess. I can't imagine how Abraham did it. I don't know if he was a little smoother than me. Maybe he was worse. It doesn't really say. But he says, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went up the mountain. When they came to the place which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son, laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But, that's a good but right there, I tell you what. The angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am. Hanini, please, anything to slow this down, anything to stop this, right? The same word again. Here I am, he said. And he said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. And as it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. This, maybe leaving your dad's farm is not radical. This feels like pretty radical obedience. This feels like it's taking the fundamental nature of obedience and shifting it and changing it in a radical way. And I wonder if, in these moments, Abraham ever thought and looked back to the moments when he was not making decisions, right? The story of Hagar and Ishmael and these different moments, if he thought that as he was being obedient to Jesus this time, as the Lord calls him to sacrifice his son, I wonder if he looked back at the times that he had messed it up and tried to do it himself and it didn't work. So, okay, God, I'll follow you, I'll trust you. But it's hard to know. What I can tell you, if we are going to walk, we said it earlier, in radical obedience, we have to have radical faith. So that's why I'm so glad last week was part 1, radical faith. That's where it starts. And now we step into obedience. It's interesting. This story is extremely applicable to where I live. I mentioned that earlier. To this day, every year, Muslims celebrate a thing called Eid al-Adha, which is the festival of the sacrifice. And they remember a story of Abraham that is told in the Quran, where it says, the prophet Abraham took his son up on the mountain to sacrifice him. Now, in the Islamic tradition, they believe that Abraham basically took the knife, closed his eyes, killed his son. When he opened his eyes, it was a ram there instead. The Bible tells a little different story. The Quran does not say, it just says Abraham took his son. So Muslims believe it was Ishmael. The Bible says he took Isaac. Either way, this isn't really the point. I remember in Cairo, when I lived there, that morning, the morning of Eid al-Adha, going down to the basement of our apartment building with my landlord. And they had 2 rams there. And they do this every day, 2 sheeps. And they sacrifice those sheeps right there in the basement of their apartment. They slaughtered them, and they gave me lamb chops for dinner that night. And they do this in remembrance of what happened on that day. And I sat there and talked with my friend, and I said, man, why do you guys do this? He goes, well, it's remembering the story. And tell me if this story sounds familiar. He says to me, Abraham was called to take his son up the mountain to sacrifice him, but God provided a sacrifice to die instead. And another story of radical obedience it reminds me of is when a man left his father's home in heaven, left the culture he had known, to come and die as a sacrifice for us. To pay a price that we couldn't pay, that when there was a price for our life, for our sin to be paid, instead of me being on that altar before God, Jesus came. He left his home, left his culture, left heaven for us, and died as a sacrifice for us. So in that moment, I had the opportunity to share that with my landlord, and that, like, I'll tell you what, if you can't get to the gospel out of the story of Abraham and Isaac, you're in the wrong line of work. But we do that. And now I want to be clear about something, though. Before we get any farther, we must not confuse obedience with sacrifice. They are not the same thing. It can be easy to look at stories like Abraham and Isaac and feel like the obedience there was greater, or the reason it's radical was because of this huge sacrifice. I understand how we can get there, but I want us to focus and realize that is not what makes it radical. The radical nature was not revealed by sacrifice, but in the counterintuitive nature of the obedience. It doesn't have to be this deep sacrifice. It could be your generosity, which at times can be a sacrifice. But it can be your service. It can be your love, your care, your compassion for those around you, for your family, for the people in our community. Every single one of those can be a step of radical obedience. So listen, our role is not to hunt sacrifice, but to passionately and radically say yes in obedience to Jesus. I love this idea. In John 21, Jesus and Peter are walking. And, this is after Peter had denied Jesus 3 times at his crucifixion. And Jesus says to him, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know I love you. Do you love me? He asks him 3 times. I think maybe, to remind him of the 3 times he had denied him earlier. But he tells him that 3 times. He asks him, do you love me? Yes, you do. Then feed my sheep. And then he says something to him, which I'm not going to read because it doesn't make sense. He says this word about like how you will serve and you'll reach out your hand and you did what you wanted, but then someone else is going to do it for you. And the Bible, thankfully, gives us these little brackets that explain to us why. He told them this so that he would know in the way that his life would glorify God, by the way he would die. So essentially, he told Peter, he's like, you're going to die as a martyr for your faith. He tells Peter this, and Peter's like, oh man. And so they're walking along, and he looks back, and I love this. The book of John, the disciple that Jesus loved. That's only written in John. I just love the idea of the guy writing about himself saying, and I, the disciple Jesus loved. He goes on. But it says he looks back at his beloved, the one that he loved. And he says, well, what about him, Jesus? What about him? Like, I'm going to die this death. Well, what about him? And Jesus says this to him that I want us to see. When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, him being John, Lord, what about this man? Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. In the same way, I think Jesus would look to us today and say, what is it to you what I withhold from one and give to another? To each of us, the command is, follow me. Follow Jesus. Why am I living in the Arab world? Because God asked me to. I don't feel that I have something special to offer or anything miraculous that I can give to this, but I know God has asked me to go, so I go. What is it God's asking you to do? What are the steps of obedience in your life? I'm not saying you're all going to come to the Arab world. Okay, that's not the only answer. Although maybe it could be an answer for some of you. Or Thailand. Or El Salvador. I don't know. But I'm doing it because I'm saying yes to Jesus. I want to tell you a story from where I live. There's this young girl in her early 20s. Met some people, got introduced to Jesus, ended up giving her life to Jesus. A radical life change, turning around out of Islam, the religion where they're taught from the age of 3 that the worst thing you could ever do was leave Islam. And the worst version of that would be for Christianity. They're taught that Christianity is evil, terrible, the worst of the worst, right? She met Jesus, she learned who he really was, and she gave her life to him. And she was fiery, like full of fire. So she went and she told her husband about this. And when he heard the story of what she had done, he turned around and reported her to the police. Turned her in, they took her phone, They searched her contacts. As a result of that, there were 3 families, this is about 8 years ago, got kicked out of the country. After a series of time, the police just said, well, it's not illegal to be a Christian, so it's fine. They sent her back, said, do what you will with her. He took her, he held her captive in their home for a long time, did not treat her well. However, she remained faithful. She read her Bible daily. She prayed for her husband, had that fire inside of her. Like I said, sometimes I think it can be lost on us because we don't have a box to put this in our experience. But man, when she gave her life to Jesus, she knew exactly what it could cost her. She had learned from a very young age what it would cost her. And it could be everything. So when she made that decision, it was not a decision she made lightly. So she was committed to it. She's reading her Bible. Through her faithful prayers, months later, her husband came back to her and said, listen, after we've done all this to you, to still believe, to still read, to still pray, to still worship Jesus, there must be something about what you believe. What is it? And I got to stand in the backyard overlooking a pool when he got in and got baptized. And there was a computer kind of like this, just sitting there facing in. And on Zoom, there were 3 boxes filled in. It was 3 families that were kicked out of the country because of him, that lost their direction, what they felt like maybe their calling was because of him. They all prayed for him. They all blessed him, encouraged him. They now have their first son. They named him Adam, which I think is kind of fitting. The first boy born to a local Christian father and a local Christian mother living in this country, as far as we know. That's radical obedience. That's Jesus said, you're to share the gospel. You're to tell people. She said, okay, that's what I'm supposed to do. That's what I'm going to do. That's radical obedience. Her obedience wasn't comfortable. It wasn't easy, but God used it. In this case, I think it was easy to see. I will say to you, I think there's times that our steps of obedience and our walk with obedience isn't always easy to see the result of. We may never see the result of it, to be honest, in this life. But what is it to me what God gives to one and withholds from another? For me, my response is, yes, Jesus, Hanini, here am I will follow you into whatever you ask me to do. So I think for us, simply put, what we're called to do is our next yes to the Lord. And like with Live Dead and with all this, it comes from a place of abiding in Jesus. If you're going to know what God's asking you to do, you better be close to him. Be in the Bible, be in the Word, be close to Jesus. Live a life of abandon, saying, God, there's nothing that I will put between me and saying yes to what you're asking me to do. And when we do that, it might look radical to some, but for us, it will be walking in the blessing of God and the calling of God in our lives. And I promise you, you will never find more fulfillment. You just have to take my word for it. And maybe there's going to be some people in here, a friend that you know, who can share a testimony of how their obedience walked in the blessing of God. Hear it from them too. But I'll tell you, the best place you can find yourself is saying yes to Jesus. So if we could just bow our heads all across this room.